Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Lynn. I'm a screening research associate with Bureau Van Dyke. I initially started working for Regulatory Data Corps about a year and a half ago and have transitioned to working as part of Bureau Van Dyke as RDC was acquired by Moody's. Since the beginning of my time with RDC, among my primary focuses has been managing our content set on marijuana-related businesses, or MRBs. Beyond the data management and acquisition angle of that responsibility, I've studied the cannabis industry itself, both in the US and globally. With all that said, I'm excited to be able to speak to you all about the cannabis industry, and I hope that by the end of this presentation, you come away with a deeper appreciation of the complexities within the cannabis industry and a stronger understanding of what it takes to monitor and onboard MRBs. Before I dive into the presentation, I'm going to quickly run through the topics I'll be covering. First, I'll speak about the legal challenges surrounding MRBs. Beyond just the legal angle of recreational medicinal marijuana, I'll also talk about hemp. After that, I'll do an overview of the current US landscape, which states are at which level of legality, recent movements, public sentiment, and so on. That section will also conclude with a brief outlook of how things might change under the new US administration. Then I will talk about the increasing complexities of the US market, things like the differences in how states license businesses, differences in the data made available, what happens when a new state legalizes either recreational medicinal marijuana, things of that nature. Following that, I will touch on value chain growth. This will include some more general topics, such as the development of new lines of business and the building out of supply chains. Then I will talk through the progression of the market. This will be a brief discussion of how the cannabis market has grown over the last several years and how it is expected to grow moving forward. After that will be the ongoing efforts to diversify cannabis products. I'll talk about some of the upcoming product categories you'll likely start seeing soon and the additional challenges those can create. Next is the international trade angle and what you might see as far as international supply chains. Nearing the end, I'll take a global view and talk more about some emerging markets and do a general run through of legislative statuses, public sentiment, and so on in the regions of the world. And last, I'll talk more about due diligence, going through best practices for navigating regulatory and reputational risk in this complicated industry. So for legal challenges. When we talk about the legal challenges financial institutions face when providing services to MRBs, the main challenge we're talking about is this rift between federal and state laws. Even if operating in a state that has fully legalized all uses of marijuana, the lack of federal legalization carries with it the threat of federal prosecution. As more states legalize marijuana to different degrees, that just creates a greater number of state and federal law conflicts. Because of that conflict, a financial institution providing services to an MRB risks running afoul of anti-money laundering laws. With marijuana illegal federally, any revenue associated could be considered proceeds of crime, and money laundering charges are a real possibility. Beyond the legal risk, there's additional reputational risk for financial institutions banking MRBs. The degrees of risk certainly may vary depending on location. For a financial institution only operating in a state like California, where all uses are legalized and public support remains high, that would be less of a concern. But beyond the general public, shareholders must also be accounted for in the calculation of reputational risk. So whatever path the financial institution chooses, it must invest in actions to enhance and maintain stringent anti-money laundering and know your customer policies and procedures. So the challenges with hemp are another area where the goalposts are constantly changing. The main conflict here is in two different farm bills, the 2014 and 2018 bills. In the 2014 Farm Bill, hemp remained a Schedule I substance, the most restrictive in criminalizing drug classification in the US, but interested states were able to apply to grow hemp plants for research purposes. Many states began pilot programs for hemp cultivation after this. Another farm bill was introduced in 2018. In this one, hemp became legal federally and was taken off of Schedule I so long as the hemp and any derived products did not exceed 0.3% THC content. Beyond that level, it would be considered marijuana and thus fall under Schedule I. So now states are all able to have non-research hemp growing operations, but the regulations became more stringent. This bill necessitated that for a state to be able to grow hemp, they must either submit their program to the United States Department of Agriculture and receive approval, or adopt the USDA's plan. The deadline for states to stop working under the 2014 Farm Bill and either receive approval from the USDA or use the USDA plan has been pushed back several times. It currently sits at January 1st, 2022. So if that date passes and a state has still not transitioned, it runs risk of growing hemp illegally. Currently, there are 20 states still growing under the 2014 bill. The resistance to transitioning stems from concerns over these restrictions under the 2018 bill. The states consider the USDA standards to be too inhibitive of the hemp industry and are working to have those standards adjusted before making the transition. This is clearly another complicated area of the cannabis industry, and certainly something that should be monitored as hemp and hemp-derived products like CBD oil increase in popularity. All right, so the current US landscape. So one of the most important questions when discussing this topic is just how far do we think this will go? Will this issue stick around indefinitely, or are further legalizations and or even federal legalization potentially in play here? It's certainly a difficult thing to predict and a hard question to answer, but looking at US public opinion on marijuana over the years, the trend is clear. The public is increasingly in favor of marijuana legalization, and today near 70% support. There are certainly still states that are more against it, and they will be roadblocks to federal legalization, but polls show that even traditionally opposed voters are coming around to the idea. So while nothing is guaranteed, it does seem that federal legalization is coming at some point. So now I'll look at the current legislative status of the US. All use is legal in 14 states and Washington, D.C. Medical use is fully legal in 35 states and Washington, D.C. 13 states allow some degree of medicinal use. The restrictions might be based on a variety of factors, most commonly the level of THC. Some states also might limit medical treatment by the ailment being treated, such as only permitting marijuana use in the treatment of something like seizures. And then that leaves us with only 2 states that still have marijuana fully illegal, Idaho and Nebraska. So as a result of, and since the 2020 US elections, we have seen some notable pro-marijuana movements. New Jersey, Arizona, New York, and Montana, which were all previously only in favor of medical marijuana, voted to legalize recreational use. New York did so just at the end of March. South Dakota became the first state where voters voted to legalize both medical and recreational marijuana simultaneously. And then Mississippi went from only allowing medical use of marijuana for the treatment of seizures to voting to fully legalize medicinal marijuana. So while these are all wins for the cannabis industry, Montana and South Dakota are both currently going through significant legislative challenges to recreational legalization. So medical legalization in South Dakota will seemingly stay, but it's possible that the governor and courts will either largely restrict or outright deny recreational legalization. So that serves as a good reminder that while examining public sentiment might be useful in a general assessment of the advancement of cannabis legalization, it's by no means going to be a reliable metric in every jurisdiction. So to do an post-election outlook, now that those states have gone further in marijuana legalization, there's still plenty of work to be done. For some, such as Montana and South Dakota, as they endure those legislative challenges, the legislation still needs to be made official. Beyond that, the regulatory framework, licensing processes, and so on need to be determined for most of those states. In the past, we've seen it take a year or more for a state to go from legalization to having actual licensed and operating MRBs. It's also notable that once licenses are issued and businesses are operating, the data that's pertinent to monitoring them will likely fluctuate in what's available and where it can be found. Even in states where marijuana has been legal for some time, the state government and licensing authorities are still figuring things out themselves. So when the states themselves are still tweaking their processes, that's another challenge inherent in monitoring this industry. So given the significant changes in leadership that occurred over the last few months in the US, I'd like to look at how those changes could influence the marijuana industry. So at the top, the Biden administration claims support for marijuana decriminalization. So there are many forms that such a change might take and countless nuances that could be a part of a bill. But this would likely drastically mitigate the risks of providing services to the marijuana industry. But nothing happens without the US Senate. Many senators have discussed pushing forward a marijuana legalization bill, though such a bill would have to either reach an unlikely 60 votes or the Senate filibuster would have to be removed, reducing that number to 50 votes, plus the tie-breaking vote by Vice President Harris. So don't worry, I'm not going to go through the ins and outs of US politics, but suffice to say that there's no lack of question marks regarding any federal bill on legalization or decriminalization. It is more likely that there would be legislation passed that stops short of legalization or decriminalization, but still provides protections and regulatory guidance for MRBs. The Safe Banking Act is a pending bill that would explicitly provide protections from federal prosecution for financial institutions, providing services to MRBs in states where it is legal. The Cole Memorandum was less formal and not as binding as the Safe Banking Act would be, but it provided general guidance that was essentially saying the federal government should be hands-off regarding states that have legalized marijuana, except in exceptional circumstances. It was rescinded in 2018, but during its time, it did succeed in halting many federal enforcement actions on marijuana. There are a few pending bills and memos that seek to accomplish something similar right now. So in the current US political climate, those would be the most feasible developments under the Biden administration. Okay, so I've already covered plenty of complexities, but here I'll touch on some focusing on the supply chain. Generally, as state acceptance increases, so too does the number of businesses that become part of the cannabis supply chain. It's not just dispensaries needing licenses, it's also cultivators to supply those dispensaries, processors / manufacturers to extract oils for other products or create edibles, among others. And there are basically no two states that approach licensing the same way. There's always some sort of state-specific requirement or procedure. Some states handle licensing within the state government's Department of Health, while others have a separate licensing authority or several, depending on the nature of the MRB's operations. Some keep it simple, licensing only things like a compassion center that controls all of their own dispensing, cultivating, processing, and so on. So that really minimizes the number of businesses to be aware of, but that setup is very unpopular with the MRBs themselves. So most states keep the licensing of each part of the supply chain separate. That's better for the MRBs, but harder for those of us trying to keep track of them all. As I mentioned earlier, the procedures themselves, as well as the data made available by the state and or its licensing authorities, are nebulous. The individuals owning the MRBs are also important to keep track of, but I believe only 10 states make that information publicly available. So it's a real challenge finding all the necessary information and keeping up with all the changes. Then there's this big push for product diversification in the marijuana industry. Wider variety of products means a wider variety of businesses that will be involved in the supply chain and thus require licensing. New types of businesses requiring licensing might mean new licensing authorities getting involved as well. So to this point, I've largely talked about how banking marijuana is a complicated matter in its current state. But this is the part of the presentation where I'll talk about the many ways in which it's likely to become further complicated. Okay, so value chain growth. Looking ahead a bit, the marijuana industry is looking at all sorts of ways to develop the value chain. This largely means expanding into new lines of business and thus expanding the target market. So new product lines in the edibles market, maybe some CBD or THC infused beverages or topicals. From this, there could be businesses that are solely dedicated to the production and supply of storage containers for whichever new product, things that don't even touch the plant. So at that point, financial institutions need to assess what they do and don't care about from a risk perspective. Maybe you want to stay away from all of it. Maybe you're only concerned with the businesses that are directly touching the plant. MRBs are also looking to do what they can to get greater control over their own supply chains. This might mean seeing things like mergers and acquisitions. Maybe a line of dispensaries is looking to acquire a line of cultivators instead of working with them through contracts. That would give them greater control over their own supply chain while still allowing them to focus on their primary function. Curaleaf is one of the biggest players in the North American cannabis industry, and we've been regularly seeing new expansions and acquisitions from them to this end. These are just a few methods of expansion that MRBs everywhere are pushing for, and doing so would no doubt require access to banking services and capital markets. So this graphic shows the progression of the marijuana market over the last few years, as well as where it's expected to go in the near future. The darker blue part of the bars refers to products categorized as flower, which the source considers to be smoked products and edibles, the more recreational uses. Note that this graphic takes into account polling that shows edibles are largely preferred over smoked products. So basically, if that dark blue would be broken down further, we'd see that a progressively higher proportion of the flower products would be edibles. The light blue is oil, So the many products that come from oil extractions, topicals, supplements, whatever they might be. The oils bar could be comfortably classified as specifically the medicinal uses of cannabis. So the uses that polls show appeal to the biggest audience. And we can see that as we go further into the future, it's projected that the overall market will consistently shift more towards medicinal cannabis products. And likely we would see that become the majority of the market share. In any case, we see that the market size will be well into the billions. So moving on to product diversification, this graphic here shows just a few of the many types of cannabis products we're likely to start seeing. So there are new types of topicals, beverages like sodas and energy drinks, more oils. For a few years now, we've seen all sorts of hemp-derived products like CBD oil show up in gas stations, corner stores, and pharmacies. The declassification of hemp from Schedule 1 in the 2018 Farm Bill has effectively given a green light for more of these products. So it's safe to assume that the popularity and ubiquity of hemp-derived products will rise substantially. So this slide will highlight a few new products for cannabis that have particularly high traction. Likely the most significant among them is beverages, especially alcoholic beverages. As you see in that picture, Lagunitas has already created products that contain THC and CBD. It might be difficult to read the labels there, but the can on the left notes 5 milligrams THC and 5 milligrams CBD, while the one on the right is 10 milligrams THC and 0 milligrams CBD. Since THC is the psychoactive component of the cannabis plant, this specific product is clearly one that would only be found in the fully legal states. In any case, it shows that the alcohol industry sees an opportunity here. And should these first ventures into cannabis prove successful, this could be a massive game changer for both the alcohol and cannabis industries. Some other product categories are snacks, which would mean everyday snack food you could find in a grocery store, not edibles. CBD infused snacks would likely be an easy, like entry-level introduction to cannabis products for many households. Coffee is also talked about. Colorado has already opened up some coffee shops that infuse their drinks with CBD. The claimed calming effect of CBD has already seen much application in the form of treats for pets. And then another claimed benefit of CBD is in helping people sleep. So there's much discussion around new CBD supplements. So you can see there are plenty of industries and product types that pair well with cannabis. As these new products come to fruition and grow in popularity, it would open the door to all sorts of new licensing requirements, as well as the possibility of significant mergers. Moving on to international trade. Now that I've talked through the rising popularity and the diversification of products, it's important to discuss the impact and extra needs that those factors create, namely an increased demand and the subsequent need to match that demand with supply. For a federally legalized country like Canada, sending parts of the supply chain overseas can solve a lot of problems. So Canada is looking to position itself as the primary exporter of cannabis products globally. But the Canadian cannabis industry is dealing with low profitability issues stemming from expensive supply chain operations and competition with black market cannabis sellers. Due to its climate, growth operations in Canada are pretty cumbersome. In many Canadian regions, outdoor cultivation does not provide year-round crop yield, and that necessitates the construction of massive, expensive greenhouses. As a result, dominant marijuana companies in Canada are looking at regions in South America to handle things like their cultivation. The soil and climate naturally lend to higher quality and year-round crop yield, and the overall costs, even after accounting for transportation, are significantly lower. So less costly and higher quality operations would mean higher profit margins and better products. Combine that with multiple polls and surveys that suggest consumers are willing to pay typically 10 to 20% more for officially licensed marijuana, and it's likely that the black market's influence in Canada would dwindle. So as the situation in Canada plays out, you can expect more international expansion in supply chains. So compliance programs must be ready to track them as they become increasingly complicated and diverse. Okay, emerging markets. Now shifting to looking at markets outside of North America, two countries stand out in their approach to marijuana, Spain and the Netherlands. While neither are federally legalized, they are relaxed and accepting enough to have become hotspots for marijuana tourism. In Spain, it is legal to grow and smoke your own cannabis for your own use, but only if done so privately. Any trafficking or public consumption of cannabis is illegal unless it is consumed in a cannabis club. These are typically in larger cities like Barcelona, and they're like any other club you might find aside from the bar and its menu being entirely cannabis products. An example of one of those menus is shown here on the right. Inside these clubs, there's no restriction on what can be bought and consumed, just consume it within the club's premises, and don't bring any products out with you when you leave. The Netherlands is the bigger tourism hotspot for marijuana, with its fully legal medical use and decriminalized possession of up to 5 grams. Additionally, consumption is fully legal in coffee shops where products can also be purchased, so long as they are consumed within the shop. To expand accessibility and control over cannabis supply, multiple cities in the Netherlands are taking part in new city-wide cultivations projects. So instead of leaving all the supply in the hands of the coffee shops, the city itself would govern the growth processes. The success of these projects would be a significant step forward for further loosening the restrictions on cannabis in the Netherlands. Overall, both countries are known for their general acceptance of cannabis, and as the industry and acceptance of cannabis grows within them and elsewhere, it would come as no surprise to see either country fully legalize cannabis in the next few years. So taking a broader look at the whole globe and the status of cannabis laws, we can quickly see in the graph that North America, South America, Oceania, and Europe are all largely accepting of marijuana, at least medicinally. North America is clearly the leader on legalized cannabis, as Canada is already fully legalized and Mexico's legalization is imminent. Uruguay fully legalized recreational cannabis in 2013, though it is still fairly restrictive and there's significant government oversight of the cannabis industry and consumption. While no country in Europe has legalized recreational use, legalization is imminent in Luxembourg. Barring any unexpected developments, Luxembourg will be the first European country to legalize. So beyond the soon-to-be legal Mexico and Luxembourg, other specific countries to watch are Spain and the Netherlands, as discussed, Australia and New Zealand, then Israel, Germany, and Denmark, and South Africa. So now I'll do a general, more forward-looking view of each region. For Europe, again, the region is largely tolerant, with many countries legalizing medicinal use and others decriminalizing recreational possession to some degree. In Luxembourg, we should see Europe's first recreational legalization. And Europe is also typically projected to have the largest market long-term. So it is certainly the region that should be watched most closely. The larger countries in Latin America, apart from Brazil, tend to support medical legalization and recreational decriminalization. There's no real frontrunner for a country to follow Uruguay's lead and fully legalize, but Latin America is likely to get more involved in cannabis, at least through supply chain expansions, as I mentioned before. The Caribbean region is generally accepting of marijuana, but overall it's expected to follow the US federal government's lead on legalization. In Asia, laws tend to be extremely restrictive outside of India, though India has seen little to no discussion on matters of legalization. It seems to be a lower priority issue for them. Thailand and South Korea do support medicinal use, but overall the cannabis industry should not be expected to take root in Asia soon. Few countries in Africa are discussing any official moves towards legalization, but across the continent, cannabis usage is high and enforcement of laws is low. South Africa is considered to be pretty close to legalization, and experts expect that if cannabis can be shown to be highly profitable in South Africa, then other countries would be more motivated to pursue official legislation. So the interests in Africa are largely economical. In Oceania, both New Zealand and Australia have legalized medicinal use. New Zealand held a referendum in 2020 on recreational legalization, but it lost by a very narrow margin. But efforts to legalize are expected to continue, and public support has consistently moved in favor of legalization. Support in Australia is also strong, and there is currently pending legislation for recreational legalization. So it's feasible that both countries would be legalized within a few years, though Australia is looking the more likely of the two. Then just some extra things that I think should be kept in mind. The UN in late fall 2020 took cannabis off of Schedule 4, which is reserved for the most dangerous substances, and thus those that should be most heavily restricted. So basically, they're acknowledging officially that there are medicinal uses for it. It's too soon to be observing any shockwaves from that change, but that and any future pro-cannabis change in the UN stance could make waves in countries across the globe. Then, and this is something that I think is especially applicable in Europe because of the European Union, is to watch the powerhouses. When a regional leader inevitably legalizes, like Germany, which has generally strong influence in Europe, and particularly within the EU, that's a big domino to fall, and other countries could soon follow suit. Cannabis legalization really strikes me as an issue that could be subject to a snowball effect, and a big country like Germany could really get that ball rolling. So now that I've run through the state of cannabis globally and all of the current and likely upcoming complexities inherent in monitoring MRBs, I'll start closing this out with a discussion of due diligence, the best practices for ensuring a strong compliance program. First, determine your risk tolerances and adjust due diligence programs accordingly. Next, stringent anti-money laundering and know your customer processes are necessary. Then identify owners and beneficial ownership whenever possible. And something I've spoken to quite a bit here, understanding the differences in laws across global jurisdictions and in the US across states. Much easier said than done, but the many nuances should be understood. Next, what I just talked about, monitoring international legislation. Legalization talks are ramping up, and it's entirely possible that just a few countries legalizing could set off a wave. So that's definitely something to stay up to date on. For advanced screening and transaction monitoring, just making sure you have a strong system in place for tracking all of the data available and identifying as many MRBs as possible. As I mentioned before, it's not always simple, as the states and licensing authorities make varying degrees of information on their MRBs available, and not every business will have an obvious name like Dankerage, a dispensary in Anchorage, Alaska. So to effectively screen against MRBs, you really need to make sure you're looking at all the databases and sources that you can. And then a quick last point, just making sure you know all the reporting obligations, like your suspicious activity reports. So for a final roundup of all the main points of this talk, for compliance and MRBs, there are plenty of legal challenges and challenges in monitoring both marijuana and hemp. Positive public sentiment on marijuana has consistently grown over time. The US market is complex as is and only figures to become more so. And part of that expected increase in complexity is the push for more product diversity, which only feeds more into the growth of a market that is already expected to grow exponentially. As the market grows, we can expect more industries to get involved, like the alcohol industry. And last, expansion across the globe really seems to be inevitable. So the last little thing I'll leave you with is this graphic I put together that I believe captures generally what's happening with the cannabis industry. In recent years, we've seen more investment in cannabis. That investment is driving innovation. Those innovations are coming in the form of a more diverse range of products. That product diversity will broaden the customer base. A broader customer base leads to increased profitability, and more profitability is just going to bring more investment, more innovation, and so on. So that will conclude this session on MRBs and compliance. Again, I'm Matthew Lin of Bureau Van Dyke, and I hope this has helped you gain a better understanding of the intricacies of MRBs and compliance, as well as a better understanding of the cannabis industry. Thank you so much for listening, and I wish you all a great rest of your day.